The views in this podcast are those of the contributors and don't necessarily represent those of CISL, the University of Cambridge or Investec, and should not be taken as advice or a recommendation. Welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in partnership with Investec. This series is hosted by Lindsay Hooper and Marc Kahn.
How do we rebuild confidence in the future? Can we harness the power of markets to deliver for climate and nature and to tackle rising inequality? And how do we innovate without exacerbating risk?
This series tackles these big questions. It surfaces new thinking, explores ideas that challenge assumptions. We acknowledge what isn't working and expose credible paths forward for business, governments, and society.
You'll hear from leaders, innovators, and critical thinkers who are grappling with the toughest challenges of our time and bringing forward important new thinking and examples of practical action. I'm Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And I'm Marc Kahn, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Investec.
This is What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future. Find us on CISL's Leadership Hub via the link in the show notes.
We're glad you're here. Let's dive in.
Young people are often cast as change makers, as innovators, as future leaders. And for years, we've told ourselves that young people will lead action to deliver a better future. But is that hope and expectation well placed, or is it really an unrealistic and unfair burden? Young people today are navigating social tensions, economic exclusion, disillusionment, and polarised politics. They're also often sidelined from real influence. So in this conversation today, we're asking how can we enable young people not just to inherit the future, but to actively shape it. To explore this, we're joined by two guests. Clover Hogan is a climate activist and founder of Force of Nature, working with young people around the world to turn climate anxiety into action. And Ravi Naidoo is a leader in creativity and innovation as the CEO of the Youth Employment Service in South Africa, which has become the world's largest private sector funded youth internship program. Together, they're going to help us unpack how young people are taking leadership today and engaging with today's leaders and what that means for the future.
So, Ravi and Clover, thank you so much for joining us. You both bring incredibly powerful perspectives on youth. We'd really like to begin by getting a sense of your personal story that brought you into this work. And Clover, if we can start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Great to be here. So I first started engaging with climate when I was about 11 years old. My catalyst was stumbling upon documentaries and then announcing over the dinner table to my parents that I wanted to become an activist, even though I really had no idea what that actually meant. But skip ahead a few years, I moved to London when I was 17. I started working as a sustainability consultant, engaging with companies and big businesses. And I was consistently struck by the kind of mental gymnastics performed by people in those spaces to kind of get away from the reality of the climate crisis. And it felt like a lot of people in these kind of seats of power were sleepwalking, whether it was in relation to climate or biodiversity collapse, racial injustice, systemic inequality. And so kind of to keep myself sane, I started going into schools and working with young people. And when I first went into schools in the UK, I went in with the kind of purpose of teaching young people about climate change, about sustainability. And yet I very quickly realized that these young people, 11, 12, 13 years old, they didn't actually need a lesson in the science. They didn't need a lesson in the facts and the statistics. Really, they needed a safe space to talk about how terrified they were about the future and about these kind of impending crises. I would chat to 11-year-olds who told me of their, apocalyptic dreams about the future, about the climate crisis. I met 13 and 14-year-old girls who told me they'd already decided they didn't want to have children because they didn't want to bring them into a world on fire. And it was such a glaring contrast from the kinds of conversations I was having with businesses to the conversations I was having in these classrooms. And what really struck me about these young people was their depth of empathy, their ability in a bubble of relative climate privilege, being in the UK, to connect with young people on other sides of the world for whom climate change is not this distant threat, but their lived experience, their day-to-day reality. And so what struck me about these young people was their humanity and their empathy, but also their capacity to question. And in addition to asking, why is the system the way that it is? What if we did things differently? And that kind of creativity and imagination is what really deeply inspired me and made me want to work with these young people to help them realize that those feelings are not a weakness. They're evidence that they're awake and they're not numb to the problems. And critically, we can actually channel those feelings into real action and supporting these young people to be change makers.
That's amazing. Thank you. Incredibly inspiring start to life. Ravi, over to you. Give us your story that got you into leading this incredible youth program for the country.
Thanks, Marc. Yeah, so I grew up, I suppose, towards the end of apartheid in South Africa, where there was such a massive change going on. And I could see then how, with people having a very positive outlook on what is possible, you could mobilize millions of people to then really surge forward and overthrow the apartheid system. So I grew up at that very activist period at the end. So I could see how mobilizing people can have a big impact in terms of social change. But then after that, I would say you could see how difficult it is to actually make that change stick and to take it forward, because you might have a change in government, a change in president. At that time, we had a great, very famous guy, Nelson Mandela. You couldn't get a better president than that. But then there's institutions and structures that are the things that replicate themselves. So then you start to look at how do institutions reproduce a particular situation. So whether it's apartheid or climate change, there's a system of power and money that makes it what it is. And if you're not aware of how to dismantle it, it always fights back. So it was both a good before and after story. And, I was also once a youth, Clover. And so my first job was, in fact, I was lucky. I was in the trade unions. And I was, in fact, leading the think tank for the trade unions. And then when I left the trade unions, I had a chance to work in government. And then when we hosted COP17 at South Africa, then we said, let's use that as an opportunity to introduce the South African Green Fund, because we knew the global fund was going to be jammed because the Chinese and the Americans weren't going to be, and we were the host. So, the host shouldn't be empty-handed. So we used that opportunity to hijack the Minister of Finance, and we had everything waiting, and then we twisted his arm at the right moment. But that fund started to then invest in a lot of renewables. And today, as you know, one of the big things behind the climate change commitments of South Africa is the fact that we are running one of the biggest renewables programs in the world, 60,000 megawatts. But a lot of the seeding happened then. And then to come to the last part of it, so then it was trade unions, governments, then with the private sector. Now, again, this is a big public-private partnership about how do we get talented young people from very disadvantaged backgrounds to get their first jobs and become game changers in the economy, and hopefully then future leaders. And if we can add all the other things to the experience, it's not just a job, but it's an understanding of what needs to be done in the future. And they're also coming from different communities to all the rich kids who might have been running the companies up till then. And maybe that brings in more of a ability to have social change. So it's really around mobilizing people towards a positive outlook, but also understanding that somewhere along the line, rules have to change and incentives have to change. So climate change would be, you tax the bad stuff, you incentivize the good stuff, you swing the machine around. But bearing in mind, it's not a benign thing. It's not something that is happening now by accident. But you have to take the machine apart and see which pieces do you want to influence, because in the real world, we had Nelson Mandela, and the scorecard from his time will be quite mixed. But if we had to do it again, maybe we would do it differently.
Ravi, let's go straight into right now. When it comes to youth in South Africa, could you give us a story that is typical of what it's like to be an average young person in South Africa faces, socioeconomically, personally, network in terms of their family?
So if I take the official stats, let's just say a typical household in South Africa is about 4 to 5 people in the household. It'd be multi-generational. So you're staying with a parent, maybe a grandparent, you've got a sibling, a couple of kids in the household. Maybe one person, if you're lucky, is employed. And the household is earning maybe the social grant or this one job, which may be 5,000 Rand, $300. That's it. The intern doesn't really know whether they're going to have a job at the end of this 12-month period. Super stressful. If you look in South Africa, the population is a very young population. So if I compare to the UK, I would say 60% of the population is under 35 and 40% is under 24, which is about double what you'd find in Germany or UK. So the country has done better than in the past in terms of education. So maybe before apartheid ended, half of the young people had finished school. And now I'd say most people have 95%, 99% have finished school, but they don't have jobs. So massive unemployment problem because you're dealing with historical issues plus new technology that you're dealing with all around the world. So we have a person in our program. His name is Fortune. And Fortune came from exactly this household that I'm describing. And fortunately, he had some good maths. So he managed to get into our program. And he got selected to be a trainee drone pilot. So what happens is, as a trainee drone pilot, with us for 12 months, the first 3 months, you'd be trained to be a qualified drone pilot. So you have a pilot's license, it's a remote pilot, a license to fly the drones. You need drones for smart agriculture. You need it for mining. We run the program with the national parks. And so he came in, he did pretty well. Today, he would be an operations manager in one of the emerging drones companies. So he was our class of 2021. In 2024, he's the manager for drones program and doing all the stuff for the game reserves that I'm talking about. And he's also supervising the next group of 50 pilots. That company. So what we're trying to do is say, okay, there is a huge opportunity for someone from a very disadvantaged background to get into a job which is good for him. It's good for the country. And at the same time, if he can pay back to that community by connecting more people from his community to come into the program, that's how we build the team. So that's sort of how we're structuring it. And last year, there were 43,000 people who came to the program like that in different sectors, green programs, renewables, all that. So that's how we're trying to curate it. It's not so much that we would create jobs for everyone who's unemployed, but can this person who comes through our program go back and be a change agent, a catalyst? And then we curate that with the best companies. And our job is to make sure that it's not greenwashing or blue washing or whatever it is. Like, are you really doing it? Are we getting the right people? But it's a massive problem because, like I say, we have about 6 million young people unemployed.
Ravi, would you therefore say that the primary anxiety of the average young person in South Africa is employment?
The short answer is yes. And I think there are many anxieties, but you could almost Maslow those in a way. So in that family social structure that I just described, where no one has a job, including your parents and your grandparents, and you have to support everyone, that would be the number one issue.
Thank you, Ravi. So, Clover, come over to you. From your experience and perspective, what characterizes the primary anxieties and concerns of young people that you spend a lot of time with?
I think a few years ago, climate and the environment and how that also intersects with social justice was consistently coming up as a kind of number one anxiety for a lot of young people. And I think it's still very prescient for a lot of young people, but it's maybe been superseded by specifically the cost of living crisis. So how expensive it is to just survive these days. And that also means that even being able to engage in activism can understandably be considered a real privilege, right? We asked that question a few years ago at Force of Nature about why is the climate space in the UK so white and so middle class? And it wasn't the fact that people from global majority backgrounds in the UK didn't care about these issues. It was simply that they didn't have the headspace, the capacity, the time and resources to go and participate in a protest or organize in their community. Oftentimes they were the breadwinner for their families, or they have much more kind of immediate concerns. And I think we've just seen that dynamic really become exacerbated as so many young people are really struggling and trying to figure out, like, how do I put food on the table and how do I keep my lights running? So I think that's a much more real reality, even here in the UK than it was a few years ago. But the way that I hear young people from a diversity of background explain it to me is not that it's kind of a list of priorities so much as this like existential soup that encompasses lots of different things. So it's, yes, job security, and it's also, I don't feel represented by the people in politics. I don't feel like they really care about me or care about my needs. For young people concerned about climate, they go to the polls and they're asked to choose between a climate change denier and a seasoned procrastinator. So they question whether they should even really engage civically in that way. A lot of young people that we've spoken to who are already facing the frontline impacts of climate are understandably terrified about what climate change means for them and their communities. Are they going to be displaced? Are they going to have to move? What does that mean for their culture and where they come from? And I think also really immediate kind of humanitarian crises like the genocide in Palestine, that is an issue that has really provoked outrage and grief in so many young people in my generation and younger. And at the same time, I think many of the outlets that young people found for exercising their voices and speaking truth to power, those avenues are being eroded away. So in 2019, there were the youth strikes for climate. In 2020, we had Black Lives Matter, young people taking to the streets, protesting, coming together in community, organizing. And now in the UK, you can go to jail for supporting certain causes and for protesting. Last year, we saw 5 people imprisoned with 4 and 5 year sentences, not for protesting, but for their role in planning to stage protests. And those are the most draconian sentences that have ever been passed down in UK history. And so I think a lot of young people feel really despairing of, well, how do I use my voice? How do I show up? And for those of us who are deeply engaged in climate, we're now not just contending with climate, we're also contending with the resurfacing of authoritarianism and fascism and really trying to organize, but I think in quite a reactive and scattered way as to how we respond to this extreme concentration and abuse of power that we're seeing play out, not just in the UK or in the US, but around the world.
That's right, yeah. If you look at people's anxieties can also be local context specific. So if you have certain things, if you have income, then the income is less of a problem. You will focus on other things. But even in South Africa, where we're talking about people not having jobs, I think it is very clear that there are many big issues that are moving forward, exactly as you are saying. There is a lot of anxiety over climate change and where is the world going from a democracy point of view and so on? Because even if you had no job, you're still thinking about other things. So I think there are multiple anxieties at play here because there is a general sense of the world is going through a stage of very accelerated change. And it can be good and it could be very bad. But you can see there's a lot of change that's happening.
So we've heard from you really powerfully about the anxieties that young people are hearing. We've also heard from both of you about the systemic challenges, about the scale of those, but also about how routes to effect change are being eroded. We want to really look at what that's going to take and look at what more is needed. One of the areas that I want to touch on first, though, is, I suppose, the cultural. What are the myths about youth? What are the perceptions that are getting in the way, this reality of what young people are grappling with? But in the space I'm in sustainability, I see a lot of assumptions around, well, youth are going to save us. And the assumptions that all young people speak with a single voice, that they're all progressive and climate committed and they're all going to take action. But I don't believe that that's the case. I think it's a more complex picture than that. And I know here in the UK, we also have a lot of media stereotyping of young people. We get a lot of talk about snowflakes or young people being entitled, which can be very challenging. And I'm interested in whether you see myths or assumptions about young people in your sphere of influence that you would like to challenge?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the term snowflake. When we first started working with young people, we started researching the rise of climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, as it's referred to. And we ended up co-leading the largest ever study into youth mental health and climate. We interviewed 10,000 young people across 10 countries. And we found that 70% of young people globally are anxious about the climate crisis. And we first started talking about this rise of anxiety. The response from pretty much every journalist was, isn't this just another sign of the snowflake generation? Like, isn't this just young people finding another thing to be upset about? And so I think that myth is really, really harmful, that young people, waking up to this existential crisis in spite of this huge propaganda machine that tries to numb us and switch us off from what's happening and disempower us. Trying to suggest that that's somehow young people being overly sensitive, I think is so harmful when we really should be celebrating that response, right? And every climate psychologist I've ever spoken to has reiterated this idea that young people feeling those feelings and being brave enough to give voice to them, that's evidence that we're going in the right direction in some ways. And actually, the problem isn't that young people are eco-anxious, it's that more people in positions of institutional power are not. So I think that's one. I think the other is that, young people are disengaged and maybe that's evidence that they don't care. I think in reality, when you sit down and actually talk to a young person, wherever they sit politically, socially, the reality is they feel deeply disillusioned and in many ways like betrayed by these kind of systems and institutions that have failed to meaningfully respond to the climate crisis, to global inequality. And so the work that we've been doing at Force of Nature is really about how do we create a space for young people from wherever they're arriving to come to terms with those different feelings, but then to really turn them into the fuel that motivates them. And rather than feeling overwhelmed, because we have this constant kind of doom scroll at our fingertips, which is this deluge of every problem happening everywhere in the world, how do we help young people recognize that impact comes from focus? And then how do you join hands with other people and work in community to take action on those issues?
Clover, I'm going to bring the cynic lens in. Because what I heard you say there is that there's a narrative which discounts young people who raise concerns that says, well, that's just young people and that's what they do. And that's very discounting to the voice. Makes a lot of sense, actually. Does your research suggest that there is something unique about young people today from generations of young people who typically do raise concerns as they enter adulthood through history? Is there something different about this time that needs to be taken more seriously than would have typically been the case in previous generations, where the old people of today remember being young and say, well, we also used to protest things, so we know the story, and then there's that discounting voice. So the cynic would say, but isn't it the same? And you're saying, no, it's not the same. There's something different. What is different?
It's a great question. Well, I would say young people have really been at the heart of so many people-powered movements throughout history, whether it was civil rights, the suffragist and suffragettes movement, anti-apartheid, the Stonewall Uprising. So often it is the younger people in society who are considered the more radical, who kind of push those boundaries. And this is purely anecdotal from my own experience and conversations, even with my parents who were out there protesting the Vietnam War and were very active in their own right. I think the key difference I've observed is that they felt that the world was trending toward a better place, right? They were on this treadmill of so-called progress. And even in the face of tremendous opposition, things were incrementally getting better. And I think the difference with a lot of young people today that I've worked with is that they feel like the world is getting worse. And I think COVID has definitely accelerated a lot of those feelings, a lot of the isolationism. Mental health is the worst for young people today than it's ever been. And so I think they don't really feel those promises of former generations manifesting in their lifetimes. It's harder to buy a house. It's harder to get on this economic ladder. We're constantly hearing the narratives about how AI is going to decimate half of the world's jobs. And so I think there's a greater sense of despair, and that's also manifesting in how young people are making really important decisions about their lives. So we did some research in America, which found that 50% of young people across the political spectrum were making decisions about where they lived and whether they started families based on the climate crisis. And so these kind of existential threats, I think, are shaping young people's lives and the decisions they make in a much more immediate way.
I think the source of anxiety is also because what's happening now is intergenerational, right? So the decisions being taken now are affecting future generations, including those generations not even born. So as a young person, if there's something making you feel uneasy, it's because a lot of the decisions now are effectively stealing from the future, right? It's the future generations that are being affected by the decisions now. So it should be making a young person uneasy, even if they haven't conceptualized it like that, because these are intergenerational impact. Climate change is fundamentally about what happens in the future based on decisions now. So if you wait as a 20-year-old till when you're 50, well, bad news. Most of those decisions are now locked in, and the impacts you'll have to bear. And the people who've made it won't have been around to suffer the consequences. So we got to see what's happening now, whether it's technology or climate change, or there are intergenerational impacts now rolling out. But in fact, it is a very big issue that's happening.
I love the framing that actually this is the rational response. Those who are not anxious are complacent or sleepwalking, I think was a term you used earlier. And this is an entirely rational response to the reality of the science and the challenges that we're seeing. I'm interested, Ravi, in whether there are any assumptions or cultural barriers that you think need to be tackled in your context, or whether actually there's a very clear-sighted view and there are not the same kind of myths or discounting of the issues. Are there any myths that you would want to challenge?
I think the one is, even though we're talking a lot about structures and institutions, it's not as if it can't be shaped by human action. So, people creating institutions, people can undo institutions and create new institutions. Even in very dark days, people still tend to be quite optimistic. I suppose, if you're going through apartheid and all of that, people learn how to carry on and fight through it. So I think culturally, South Africans are very resilient. And I would think a lot of it comes down to how individuals can be actually activated, and culture of organization becomes very important. So South Africans have a history of good organization for change. And I think what also helps is to have a theory of how the change is happening and how the change can be undone.
Ravi, you were a youth activist during the change that came about when apartheid was dismantled. So you can personally attest to fighting the good fight for a better future. Is there a difference now for the young people that you see in South Africa when they look to their future? Given your comment earlier around the decisions being made now are long-term, intergenerational, and there's almost a sense of helplessness that young people have to deal with in terms of changing a future that gets baked in now. Would you say that's very different to when you were fighting for the end of apartheid yourself?
I would say the generation now is probably a bit smarter than we used to be, because we have a better sense of what you're up against. So previously, I didn't think people took the role of the media as seriously as they did now. You just accept, you sort of saw things and that was a story. You didn't really question what's behind the story. Where does it come from? I think now the one good thing about social media, it's helped independent media and stories to get out. But then it does mean you've got a hell of a lot of fake news, which is the problem. But for those groups who can wade through that and get to more authoritative sources, it's better. I think, unfortunately, what's probably worse and now is the economic concentration is much worse than what it was. And now the West doesn't even pretend, the US, for example, whether it's a democracy, it's full odds. It was always good if at least one side was pretending, at least you could hold them to the pretense. But essentially, people have much more access to information and to get these stories out. But you have to be much more discerning about how that information is polluted. But I think globally, the world is much more disorganized. If I think about South Africa, that we could call upon, I was just a youngster then, but South Africa could really call upon international support, whereas now I think it's much more disjointed. So I think the collective action problems globally a real vexing problem because, even if you agreed, what is the UN? The UN is an institution which is good for some things, but it's really stymied by powerful countries that could just ignore it. So it's a problem.
You were talking there about people being better sighted on what they're up against and about being more media savvy. How are young people using their agency today? And keen to know how that's evolving. And it may be that I'm clearly much older and I'm used to looking for traditional forms of engagement and activism that might be more around visible protests and petitions or engaging in party politics. I'm interested in how youth are using their voice and agency in effective ways at the moment.
I think young people today are really great at taking quite subversive routes into creating change. So I know for one, there are plenty of young people who have made active decisions to engage with businesses or policymakers with the purpose of being disruptive and kind of contrarian. And I find that quite inspiring because I think it's some of the hardest work you can do. It's one thing to shout from outside of the building. It's another to go in and to really be that kind of agitator. So we work with a whole network of young people who are doing that, who are also working as whistleblowers, collaborating with like nonprofits and NGOs to try and hold some of these big corporations to account. We're seeing young people also take very direct tactics. So in the US, going up to elected officials and representatives and directly confronting them. And again, using these kind of subversive tactics like, oh, hey, so-and-so, how's your day going today? Oh, and by the way, what's with the funding of Zionism in Israel? Or what's with the, 20 million contribution you just received from the fossil fuel industry? So young people, I think, are not afraid to really go head to head and to bring, like a bit of cheeky energy, I suppose, into those sort of interactions. And then using social media and content creation to create stories as well and to bring the conversation into the domain. And we were just touching on that, the different third-party kind of places we can tell stories and challenge the narrative because young people are they're not going to the New York Times or the Guardian necessarily, they're going to their phones to get that information. We're also seeing really amazing examples of young people organizing politically. So we just saw Mamdani's campaign in New York. 1 in 200 New Yorkers were part of actively canvassing for him. And it was very much orientated to Gen Z and really contradicted the kind of mainstream narrative that, well, young people don't care or they're not politically engaged. Young people need someone or they need a movement to get behind. And then if you entrust them to do that, they'll show up with all of the skills and the kind of tenacity and grit to get that job done. So I think those are just a handful of kind of examples. And then I think otherwise young people are going outside of existing organizations to kickstart their own initiatives as well. So one of the projects we started at Force of Nature was called Climate Cafes, and it provided a very simple template for young people to organize in their own communities. And to date, we've had the most climate cafes across the African continent, which is really, really cool. So we've had hundreds and hundreds of young people organize in their community to work on climate, to develop solutions. And I think it's really testament to the fact that you don't actually need to give young people a lot to embolden them to start solving for the issues in their own communities and in their own neighborhoods.
Thank you. A great example there from New York. On the tactics that you outlined, I acknowledge that is really hard work. I'm a great champion of that happening, but I also hear and see the narrative around actually it doesn't work and it alienates people. And we know there's been a lot of discourse around some of the protests in the UK that have blocked working people from getting to work. The narrative suggesting that has lost public support. So I'm interested in your response to that, whether those direct and subversive tactics are always effective. But what's your view on the effectiveness, or does it actually end up alienating others and wider society? Because I know that's been a challenge against some of those tactics. Like, we love the aim and the ambition and the drive, but is it working?
Yeah, it's super interesting because a very direct parallel would be the suffragettes, right? Who, by every measure, were way more radical than the climate activists today. They weren't throwing cornstarch and food dye onto paintings, which can easily be wiped off. They were actively destroying original works of art and protesting within Parliament, busting down doors. And yet we look back on the suffragettes and we go, wow, how brave. and how grateful we are that those women fought so that I can have the rights that I do today as a woman in this country. So I think there's a real double standard. And I think a lot of the negative narrative around nonviolent direct action is a direct product of the Murdoch media in this country. It is the billionaire press, the outlets like The Sun, like The Telegraph, which are directly financed and line the pockets of billionaires. They're the ones who have consistently been very effectively making the story about the messenger to detract attention from the message. So they portray environmental activists as radicals, terrorists, extremists, very, very similar language to that which was leveled at the suffragettes of the time and other protest movements throughout history. So I think we need to really, really be concerned about how that narrative is stripping us of our kind of democratic freedoms, right? If they can now say that Palestine Action, for example, is a terrorist group and they can arrest anyone who associates, we should really be concerned for what that means for every single one of us. If you can be arrested, not just for protesting, but for your role in staging a protest, it feels pretty dystopian. Because then you can be punished for your political views, right? And that's where you start sliding toward authoritarian kind of states. And we're seeing that already manifest in a really extreme way in America, with students being deported, people being isolated and interrogated for their political beliefs.
Can I come in there and bring the cynics out on this point? I mean, when I step back and I listen to the way you've characterized it, it's almost like there's the voice of youth is good, and the voice of the billionaires and the institutional power is bad. And there's a very clear fight, I mean, is it as binary as that? I mean, to what extent is the voice of youth potentially also wrong, and the voice of the billionaire or the older people or the institution wise? Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm saying, just from a cynical point of view, it seems a little binary of good and evil. And I do get the historical reflections, but I'm just wondering to what extent young people look at it that way.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one thing I would say is that in all of my interactions with people working within business, people working within policy, I've learned time and time again that it's no use vilifying people within these institutions, because if I sit down with a business leader, even if from the outside I'd say, well, I think what you're doing is bad, or I don't like your company, odds are we can find plenty of things to agree on. And I think that's what really struck me when, as an activist coming from the outside in, when I first had those conversations, I was like, oh, you want many of the same things that I do. You want the same world. You want to pass over a positive legacy to your children, right? And so there was more in common than there was in difference. But what I will say is that if we look at the ways that change has happened throughout history, power does not give itself up. It isn't people who have all of the resources, who have all of the institutional power, who one day wake up and say, maybe we should actually redistribute this wealth or resources. There are obviously anomalies, but historically, it's people on the margins of society, people who have been crushed by the extreme concentration of wealth or having their rights stripped away. It's people on those margins who feel disenfranchised, who are able to step up with the courage to say, we need to do things in a radically different way. And I think what's unfortunate, and there are many, many capitalists who have acknowledged this at this point in time, that the system makes it increasingly difficult to do the right or responsible thing when you are in that position of power. Today, we have the 26 wealthiest people who own the same amount as the poorest 3.8 billion. So the concentration of wealth is just getting worse and worse. And we need genuine institutional systemic change and reform to be able to redistribute wealth. We can talk about economic growth, but we have to talk about, okay, but who's actually seeing the benefits of that? Because right now our economic system concentrates wealth and the benefits in the hands of the few, and it displaces the costs, pollution, ill health to the many. And so it isn't even a matter of young people. I know so many intergenerational folks who are working on this, who've been working on climate and the environment for decades longer than I've even been around. But it is recognizing that the people and the ways of thinking that created this problem, I believe, are not going to be the ones to also get us out of it.
I think we can all agree that a world where the billionaires are dominating politics and using their tech platforms to further entrench themselves is bad, objectively bad, right? Even if it wasn't 2025 and it was 1975, you'll still say you have to look at what's happening to economics, to technology, and to democracy. Those things, how they combine, shape how the future goes. I'd add climate change to that as well, which is like a very skewed economics dominating democracy, and the technology anyways running ahead of where the rules are. That is the worst combination of those historical factors that drives the future. So even if you didn't theorize it like that as a young person, you would certainly see that billionaires running politics using technology platforms to further take over power is a recipe for disaster. And that's where, if that reinforces itself, we do go down a dystopian path. If you in some way were able to arrest that and say, well, why don't we implement green policies? Or if technology is going to free us from work, well, then let's have universal income. In terms of social media, digital media being so good, but then let's look at how we regulate out fake media. Fake news, algorithms that generate that kind of. But I think we can objectively say that some of what we are witnessing now is very negative versions of those forces that are combining in a bad way.
Yeah, completely agree. And I also think it's really important, and agree with Clover on this protection of rights and laws. If we see this kind of, well, it's not on my doorstep and, it's not my issue and let it slip, I think there's a real risk that we will lose the foundations of our ability to respond. So we're increasingly here at CISL being clear that this isn't only about climate solutions and nature solutions. We also need to tackle inequality, but we need to make sure we've got the foundations to be able to do so. And that requires protection of rights and laws, or we will just have chaos, and that will suit only the billionaires, and we actually won't serve businesses well either. Who is investing in and supporting young people's agency? You clearly are doing so really effectively in your own domains. But I'm interested to hear your views on what more is needed and actually what works well, because we haven't got time to waste on things that are kind of well-intentioned but don't work well. How do we ensure that our systems for developing and supporting young people are really equipping them to shape the system and not just, I suppose, slotting them into broken systems so they just end up being frustrated or disillusioned, parts of the bigger problem? Maybe start with you, Ravi, given you spend a lot of time looking at institutional challenges.
So I suppose the one thing is always good to sort out the good actors from the bad actors, right? So even though we are programmed that wants as many companies as possible to come in and fund, because that's what fuels our program, we would tend to not want a bad company to join and pretend to be a good company, because either way, it's a social label. So if we want to be part of the good team, we would definitely want to bring in companies that are more genuinely interested in positive changes, as opposed to the ones that are pretending. So I think that's probably the first thing we want to do. And therefore, we try to be very protective in terms of how you get into the program. The second thing is sort of catalytic ingredient is the young person themselves. We don't believe we on our own can solve all the problems. So we work on a very collaborative basis. So let's say we are very focused on green programs, for example, right? So we would work with the banks that are, for instance, very keen on financing the green and renewable programs. And we'll try to find the job categories that will help people get into jobs of the future. And we would hope that those young people also become evangelists in a way. I normally don't like evangelists, but evangelists who would be able to now motivate for those green programs, because they would be the ones probably sitting in positions of authority years from now. So it's not just a job. You have to think about it with the other dimensions as well. And then the last thing that's part of the institutional change is we also support rules, but the idea is not so much to break rules and cause chaos, but to be able to also change the rules, right? Because let's agree, rules always are there to be changed for the better. And we want to have rules that impose penalties on things that we now can agree are negative. So let's take all your high CO2 carbon intensive things. And then you want to shift that resources, whether by tax or regulation or some other form, towards things that are less carbon intensive or better. So if you can change the rules in that way, then you begin to pivot the system. So all of those things have to come into the mix. But in the end, you do need people right across the spectrum who are very supportive, who are technically competent, confident, can play a leadership role. And, it's not just the people in this room or a small group. You need quite a mass base. I think that's where South Africa got it wrong, or could have done more, is in the end, a small group of people gets outflanked and surrounded and captured very fast. And if you don't have a constant replenishment, like a whole generation shift, you eventually run out of steam. So I think even though that's not officially our mandate, I think it's implied. I think is what they say in the movies. It's implied. If you're saying changing society, then it's implied that people think about social change in a positive way. And our job is really to prepare that next generation.
Yeah, I love what you're doing, Ravi, because I think it's so important to actually create those economic pathways for young people. And I think so many organizations say, oh yeah, we love young people and we want to platform them, but are not actually putting in that work to understand, okay, well, how do we actually enable young people to enter the green economy? Because right now there are so many young people, there's a surplus of young people who want those kind of jobs, but they aren't receiving the allyship or the mentorship or the resources and support to actually seek out those careers. So I think those kinds of interventions are so incredibly important. When talking about like how to meaningfully engage with young people, you have to truly understand the value of working with young people to do it in a meaningful way. A lot of companies wanted to engage with young people as a means of kind of youth washing because it made them look good, because they wanted to use young people in some way. And I'm really interested in those interventions that meaningfully give young people a seat at the table. And I think we've seen some really great examples. There's the Future Generations Commission, which came out of Wales, which I think is such a neat idea because, to Ravi's point earlier, it's how we actually making decisions in government and across different departments and companies that take into account the world that young people are going to be inheriting, right? That totally transforms what our priorities are. If we're not thinking in terms of quarterly cycles or the next 4 years, but actually, what is the world going to look like when I'm 50, for example? And so I think those kind of initiatives are incredibly important. And then one of the initiatives we've been working on here in the UK is with Secretary of State Ed Miliband, who is the first person to sign onto the new NDC clause, which is all about the rights of young people. And so we're now working through Miliband's team on how do we actually enshrine the rights of young people in the way that this government makes decisions, particularly regarding climate change. And so there are really, really important kind of interventions that can meaningfully give young people that seat at the table, not just hand them the microphone and plop them on the stage, but that actually gives them a say over the decisions that, to Ravi's point, are ultimately going to shape our future.
So most senior to mid-career leaders in predominantly major organizations, private sector, financial institutions, government, many of those people care very deeply about the future that their children are going to inherit. But many of them themselves feel trapped in short-termism. They feel that they're influenced or trapped by the systems and cultures that they're having to operate within and what they get rewarded for and what they would get fired for. So I'm interested beyond the interventions that bring youth to the table. They will make many more decisions every day. And I'm interested in what your message would be to those leaders who are deeply concerned and feel conflicted. They want to do better, but feel really trapped. And what I've heard from you already is that you see the mental gymnastics that they're undertaking, and that's sleepwalking, and that they aren't necessarily challenging, but rather defending in machines that self-perpetuate and that need to be willing to challenge and take the machine apart. And heard that what we don't want is tokenism and youth washing or pretending to be good businesses when they're not. What would you think is realistic that leaders in businesses today could and should be doing?
Just taking the wheels within wheels approach, right? So politics to a large extent is driven by what happens in the economy with money. If you think about how politicians are funded and how systems survive, when the system runs out of money, it collapses. So the one place I would start from a business point of view is to acknowledge that the shareholder value model has come to the end of its life and needs to be replaced by an intergenerational value model. So you would in the boardroom have an empty chair. Just think about that. But the empty chair is for the people who are not there. So the new generation might be 10 years old, the people not even born. And you're thinking about your decisions now, how do they affect the generations that are still to come? So you don't have business models that are essentially depleting environmental resources, let's take it, and passing that cost and consequence onto future generations. So even if I just take a normal corporate governance model and say, well, actually don't know, Marc, where the key models on that. But I think the way I would do it is to say, well, all right, now we have an intergenerational value model, which is forcing decision makers in companies, which will eventually influence politics, to now change how they think. And as that happens, as that wheel turns differently, then political wheel will also start to change to some extent. Not that there won't be interference with that, but you've got to change the way in which corporates are thinking and regulated that does not discount future implications. So I think that would be the main change, I would say. There'll be a ton of other things, but that would be the main one.
I think that the description that, Ravi, you've just produced is we need to change the market economy, the fundamentals of capital flows and short-term returns that the market is based on. That's the underlying mechanism which regulates this activity, and all things seem to flow from that. Such an enormous change feels, to an older person like me, overwhelming. Even personally, seems almost out of reach. And yet at the same time, I mean, I've got 4 children. One of them looks about your age. Sometimes find myself overwhelmed with the feeling that the system is too entrenched to change. And one feels a sense of hopelessness. If I'm feeling that, I know what my daughter is feeling and the other kids. I mean, what do we do now? What now? Okay.
Here are 10 steps for overhauling capitalism.
Yes. Okay, step 1. Can we just write this down, please?
No, it's such a great question. And I think that feeling of overwhelm is so normal. The first thing I would say, if you read up on planetary boundaries, the reality is nature and the climate is going to force massive change and disruption upon us. That change is going to come. It's just a matter of whether we do it once the water is lapping at our doorsteps or whether we do it now. And so it's going to be painful either way. And unfortunately, because of this history of inaction, there's a lot of climate breakdown that we're going to see in our lifetimes, right? And so right now, a lot of companies are operating from this kind of short-term mindset where they're saying, well, we're just trying to survive for the next year, the next few years. That fundamentally has to change. I think a few proposals that I personally find really, really exciting. They're not the entire answer, but they're part of it. I think one is citizens' assemblies. So within our political landscape, we know that power corrupts. We know that so many of our politicians are in the pockets of big corporations, in part because companies can now buy elections and have such a sway over our democracy. Citizens' assemblies are all about how do we move from a representative democratic model to deliberative democracy. So how do we actually put meaningful power back in the hands of people? And there are some countries that are already modeling this. France is modeling it on climate policy. Ireland modeled it with gay marriage and also bodily autonomy for women, so abortion rights. Those were both wins and products of deliberative democracy, so citizens' assemblies. So that is one model that I think is incredibly important. I think the other is we need to take on corporate lobbying. So a lot of this kind of corruption of politics is happening in plain sight because we're giving corporations disproportionate voice and say rather than giving that voice and say to everyday people, to NGOs, to other kind of stakeholder groups. So legislation around how we actually curb lobbying is really, really important if we're going to change these institutions from the inside out. The other thing is legislation that reflects the true value that companies are both extracting and creating. So one piece of legislation that's come out of the EU is extended producer responsibility that says, say a fast fashion company like H&M, they're no longer going to be allowed to produce tons and tons of textile waste and then just ship that off to countries like Uganda and say, it's your problem now. We don't want to worry about it. We're actually going to place an economic cost on that textile waste, and companies will have to embody that in the cost of their products. So I think there are lots of pockets of hope around how we can curb the system, but I suppose my answer is that it's going to have to change purely because of planetary dynamics and climate collapse, one way or another. The question is whether we sit on our laurels and wait for that to happen to us 20, 30 years down the line, or whether we get the kind of jump start and activate that change now.
If I went home and I said to my daughter, I've spoken to some really incredible people here, and the future isn't hopeless because of two things. One, there are some really good things going on, the examples you've given. And even if those are not enough, which they probably aren't, soon enough, nature will force us to change, which would be sad because there'd be some damage, unnecessary damage because we didn't change fast enough. But change is coming one way or the other.
Change is coming one way or another. And we have to interrogate some of the narratives that are contributing to this feeling of powerlessness as well. I think that feeling of despair is not entirely our own. I think it's also manufactured in many ways. And one way to interpret, say, what's happening in America right now is that fossil fuels are winning. The reality is the fossil fuel industry funded Trump's campaign to the tune of $75 million. Why did they do that? Because they know that they're losing. New renewable projects are now cheaper around the world than new fossil fuel projects. Fossil fuels have an expiration date, but they're working as hard as they can. They're working in overdrive to try and delay meaningful action, even though renewables are already reaching those market tipping points. So you can actually interpret this situation as we've made tremendous progress, right? We've been able to achieve so much. Our job is now to accelerate that and get the people on board who feel powerless to recognize that actually we're capable of creating so much tremendous change, but we'll only get there by having the courage to not just articulate what's going wrong in the world right now, but what is the world that we actually want to create, and then start creating.
Let's bottle that and sell that, people.
What's one thing you would want to leave listeners with, an encouragement to a specific action, a way of thinking about or framing this as they leave this podcast in the weeks and months ahead? I'm going to turn first to you, Ravi. What's your key message or takeout?
Well, I think it's very important for leaders in corporates and government just generally to really think about what can we do that is radically different to start to change the rules, to shift even by a few degrees. But as you say, over time, that really starts to make a big impact. So how you can incorporate those voices and considerations into your business model now, and then, that would begin to have a sort of a time extended impact. So I think that would be the main thing I would say now. Thanks.
Thank you. On Clover?
Keeping on today's theme, I would say talk to the young people in your life. Be open, because I think that's the only way that we can grow and learn from people who might have different perspectives from our own. And I would also say, if you're feeling stuck or you're feeling overwhelmed, give yourself license to tap into that younger version of yourself. Perhaps the version of yourself you might discount as naive or too idealistic or too radical. Allow yourself to tap into that energy and think, okay, well, what did I want to see in the world as a young person? Before I took on responsibility and pressure and, maybe got stuck in a job that I didn't particularly love, what did I want to be and what did I want to see? And I think that can help create the space for the kind of imagination and innovation and creativity, frankly, that we need to be able to address these big and complex problems.
Thank you, Clover and Ravi, for joining us today. It's really clear that many young people feel deeply anxious about the future, particularly in relation to climate change, cost of living, and the state of politics. And these are clearly rational concerns. And in fact, older generations who are not concerned are perhaps those who are acting most irrationally. We've heard about the need for practical action beyond just projecting hope onto younger generations to actually enable them to engage in shaping the future. that those in positions of power today can build youth perspectives and youth engagement into their strategy and decision-making to facilitate change, but also the potential for embracing those characteristics that we associate with youth, creativity, innovation, and a questioning spirit, and how these are essential and powerful tools for transformation. Join us next time for What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future.
This show is presented by Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive of CISL, and Marc Kahn, Investec's Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. The producers are Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and Alexa Selwood. The executive producer is Gillian Secret, and it's produced in partnership with Investec. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, subscribe on any major podcast platform or visit the Leadership Hub on the CISL website or Investec Focus. You'll find the address in the show notes.